Hello and welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into something darker, something raw. If this is your first time here, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of stories. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always strangely comforting to know who else is out there, drifting through myths in the quiet hours. So get comfortable, dim the lights, let the world outside fade to nothing, because tonight we're traveling to ancient Greece, to battlefields soaked in blood, to the clash of bronze on bronze, to the screams of dying men and the thunder of war chariots. We're going to meet a god that even the other gods couldn't stand. We're talking about Ares, the god of war, bloodlust, and battle. Now, when most people think of war gods, they imagine noble warriors leading armies to glorious victory, strategic masterminds orchestrating perfect campaigns, protectors defending their people with righteous fury. But Ares, he was none of those things. He wasn't interested in glory or honor or protecting anyone. He was interested in the fight itself, the blood, the screaming, the chaos, the beautiful, terrible moment when men forget everything except the weight of their swords and the face of the enemy in front of them. The Greeks had what you might call a complicated relationship with Ares. Actually, that's being generous. They pretty much hated him. His own father Zeus once called him the most hateful of all the gods. Imagine being so insufferable that the king of the gods, who himself wasn't exactly winning Father of the Year awards, openly despises you. That takes a special kind of talent. But here's the interesting part. While the Greeks couldn't stand Ares, they also recognized something essential about him. He embodied the reality of warfare, stripped of all its romantic nonsense. No heroic speeches, no noble causes, just violence, fear, and death. In a culture that valued wisdom, restraint, and strategic thinking, Ares represented everything they tried to rise above. Yet they couldn't deny he was part of the world, part of human nature, part of the divine order. So who was this god that even Olympus rejected? What made him tick? And why, despite being one of the 12 great Olympians, does he appear in relatively few myths, and when he does, he's usually getting humiliated in spectacular fashion? Tonight, we're going to explore the blood-soaked world of Ares. We'll delve into his tumultuous birth, his scandalous affair with Aphrodite that ended in public humiliation, his chaotic role in the Trojan War, and his eventual transformation into the Roman Mars. We'll meet his terrifying children, witness his spectacular defeats, and try to understand why the Greeks simultaneously feared and disdained him. This is going to be a journey through the darker corners of Greek mythology. So settle in, let the stillness wash over you, and prepare yourself for a tale of rage, humiliation, passion, and the eternal human struggle with violence. Let's begin. Every god has an origin story, and Ares tells us quite a bit about the Greeks and what they thought was important. Unlike many deities who sprang from unusual circumstances or bizarre cosmic events, Ares had a straightforward, almost disappointingly normal birth. He was the son of Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of Olympus, legitimate, recognized, born to power, and yet nobody liked him. Think about that for a moment. Ares was born with every advantage. His father ruled the cosmos. His mother was queen of the gods. He had divine blood from both sides. No weird origin story involving being swallowed, or born from sea foam, or springing from someone's head like his sister Athena. Just a regular Olympian birth to the most powerful couple in existence. But Zeus couldn't stand him. In Homer's Iliad, Zeus tells Ares to his face, "To me you are the most hateful of all gods who hold Olympus. Forever quarreling is dear to your heart, wars and battles." This is your father, mind you. The person who's supposed to love you unconditionally, basically saying, "I hate you more than any other deity in existence." Zeus goes on to say that if Ares weren't his own son, he would have hurled him into the deepest pit of Tartarus long ago, down there with the Titans and all the other primordial nightmares the gods tried to forget about. Harsh, brutally harsh. Hera, his mother, had a more complex relationship with her son. She was protective of him, as mothers tend to be, but even she couldn't deny his nature. Some versions suggest she spoiled him, that her indulgence created his worst tendencies. Zeus actually blamed Hera for Ares' behavior, saying her coddling made him insufferable. So we have a divine family dynamic where the father openly loathes his son, and blames the mother for ruining him. Not exactly the nurturing environment one hopes for. Ares had siblings, of course. Hebe, goddess of youth, was his full sister, as was Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth. Then there was Hephaestus, the smith god, though his status as Hera's son or Hera's alone varies depending on who's telling the story. And then there was Athena, his half-sister, born from Zeus's head after he swallowed her mother Metis. Athena would become Ares's greatest rival and most frequent humiliator. Here's where things get interesting. Both Ares and Athena were war deities, but they represented completely different aspects of combat. Athena embodied strategic warfare, the careful planning, the disciplined troops, the intelligent use of force. She was war with a purpose, war as a tool to achieve specific goals. When generals gathered to plot their campaigns, they invoked Athena. When cities built walls and organized their defenses, they honored Athena. Ares, on the other hand, was war as an end in itself. The bloodlust, the fury, the mindless violence that consumed everything in its path. He was the moment when strategy fails and battle becomes a brawl. When formation breaks and it's every man for himself. When your friend dies beside you and you can't even stop to mourn because someone's trying to kill you too. That was Ares. The Greeks vastly preferred Athena's approach. She was wise, measured, honorable. She protected cities and gave counsel to heroes. She won battles through cleverness and superior tactics. Ares just charged in swinging and hoped for the best. More often than not, he lost. Even when he fought badly, getting defeated by his sister repeatedly, wounded by mortal heroes, and generally making a mess of things. The very name Ares tells us something about how he was perceived. Scholars believe it derives from the Greek word ara, which means curse, ruin, or bane. His name literally meant destruction, not victory, not strength, not even war. Just destruction, the ruin that comes with conflict. That's what the Greeks saw when they looked at Ares, not a god to be admired, but a force to be endured. This could imply something about his nature. Some scholars suggest Ares might have had Thracian origins, though this remains a topic of scholarly debate. Thrace, in the Greek imagination, was a wild northern region, populated by warlike barbarians who didn't share Greek values of restraint and civilization. By associating Ares with Thrace, the Greeks may have been saying, "This god isn't really one of us. He's foreign, uncivilized, other." Based on what we know from Greek literature and cult practices, this could have been a way of distancing themselves from what he represented. In artistic depictions, Ares was typically shown as a powerful, fully armed warrior. Helmet gleaming, shield raised, spear at the ready. Sometimes he wore full armor, bronze catching the light in all its terrible beauty. Other times he was depicted nude, emphasizing his physical perfection and masculinity, a classical Greek approach to showing divine power. He was undeniably handsome, strong, imposing, the kind of figure that should command respect. But appearances can be deceiving. For all his physical might, Ares lacked the qualities the Greeks truly valued. He had no wisdom, no self-control, no sense of justice or proportion. He was passion without reason, strength without purpose, violence without victory. And in a culture that prized the mind as much as the body, that made him fundamentally flawed. His divine household wasn't exactly peaceful either. His retinue consisted of various personifications of war's worst aspects. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, was often by his side, sowing chaos wherever she went. You might remember Eris from another famous story. She's the one who started the Trojan War by tossing a golden apple inscribed "for the fairest" into a gathering of goddesses, sparking a divine beauty contest that eventually led to Paris, Helen, and the burning of Troy. Eris knew exactly how to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. Then there were Phobos and Deimos, Ares' sons by Aphrodite. Their names tell you everything you need to know. Phobos is the root of our word phobia, meaning fear, the paralyzing terror that freezes warriors in place. Deimos means dread or terror, the specific horror that comes from facing death in battle. These two accompanied their father into every conflict, not as actual combatants, but as psychological forces that broke men's spirits before the fighting even began. Picture it. Ares arrives at a battlefield, and with him comes crushing fear and overwhelming dread. Brave men suddenly question their courage. Experienced warriors remember every friend they've lost. The certain knowledge of death settles on everyone like a shroud. That was the gift Phobos and Deimos brought to war, and Ares, their father, loved them for it. Then there was Enyo, a goddess of war herself, sometimes called the sister of Ares, sometimes his companion or even his daughter, depending on which source you consult. She was specifically associated with the act of killing, with blood and slaughter. Where Athena might wound strategically to disable an opponent, Enyo, like Ares, went straight for the kill. Maximum violence, maximum bloodshed. This was the company Ares kept. Not noble heroes or wise counselors, but embodiments of everything dark and terrible about warfare. Fear, terror, discord, bloodshed. When Ares arrived on a battlefield, these forces came with him, turning organized combat into horrific chaos. The Greeks recognized that war, unfortunately, was sometimes necessary. Cities needed defending, wrongs needed righting, honor demanded satisfaction. But the way Ares approached war, the sheer delight he took in carnage, the complete absence of any higher purpose, that horrified them. They saw war as a necessary evil at best, something to be conducted with restraint and for just causes. Ares saw war as entertainment, and so the most hated son of Olympus roamed the ancient world, seeking conflict, causing chaos, and somehow managing to lose more fights than he won. He was powerful, yes, divine, certainly, but respected, beloved, not even close. Even his fellow Olympians kept their distance. At the divine feasts on Olympus, one imagines Ares sitting alone at the end of the table, or making uncomfortable conversation while the other gods quietly avoided him. Apollo would be charming someone with music and poetry. Hermes would be telling jokes and pulling pranks. Dionysus would have wine flowing freely and everyone laughing, and Ares would be there, radiating uncomfortable aggression, making everyone wish he'd just leave early. But he was part of the pantheon, part of the divine order, and the gods had to tolerate him. Just as mortals had to acknowledge that war, for all its horrors, was part of their world. Ares wasn't going anywhere. He was eternal, indestructible, and apparently unteachable. So the Greeks told stories about him, but not the kind of stories that inspire worship and devotion. They told stories that revealed his flaws, his defeats, his humiliations. They crafted myths that showed what happens when rage and violence exist without wisdom to guide them. In their own way, these stories were warnings. Be strong, yes. Be brave in battle, certainly. But don't be like Ares. Don't let the bloodlust consume you. Don't lose yourself in violence. Because if you do, you'll end up like the god of war himself. Powerful but pathetic, fierce but foolish, feared but fundamentally alone. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what made Ares so tragic. He was born to rule beside the greatest gods, but he squandered every advantage. He had divine power but used it poorly. He should have been magnificent, but instead became a cautionary tale, the most hated son of Olympus indeed. To understand Ares, we need to understand what the Greeks meant when they invoked his name. War in ancient Greece wasn't a single concept with a single god. It was multifaceted, complex, containing both noble and terrible elements. And the Greeks, in their wisdom, divided these aspects among different deities. Athena got the glory. She was the goddess of strategic warfare, of tactics and planning, of disciplined armies marching in formation. She represented war as an art, a craft, something that could be perfected through intelligence and skill. When the Athenians defeated the Persians at Marathon, outnumbered but victorious through clever positioning and discipline, that was Athena's kind of war. Ares got everything else. He was the personification of what happens when strategy fails and battle becomes a brawl. The moment when formation breaks and it's every man for himself. When fear grips your chest and you can't remember why you're even fighting. When pain stops registering because the adrenaline is so overwhelming, when nothing exists except the next enemy to strike down. That was Ares. The Greeks had a word for the kind of warfare Ares embodied. Battle lust. Not the calculated aggression of a disciplined soldier, but the wild, intoxicating fury that makes men charge into impossible odds. The state where death becomes meaningless, where nothing matters except the fight. It's dangerous, it's destructive, it's utterly consuming, and it's absolutely intoxicating. Ares loved the din of battle. The specific phrase used in Homer was that he delighted in the roar of war. Imagine standing in the middle of a battlefield, shields crashing against shields, swords striking armor, men screaming in rage and pain and terror, the ground shaking from charging cavalry, the air thick with dust and blood and the smell of death. Most people would find that horrifying. Ares found it beautiful. He found it perfect. He wasn't interested in who won or why they were fighting. He didn't care about justice or righteousness or any of the causes that supposedly justify warfare. Give Athena a righteous cause, and she'd plan a brilliant campaign. Give Ares any excuse for violence, and he was happy. It didn't matter if it was Greeks fighting Trojans or Spartans fighting Athenians or some petty border dispute between city-states that nobody would remember in a generation. If men were killing each other, Ares was satisfied. His sacred animals reflected this nature perfectly. The vulture, which feeds on carrion, on the bodies left behind after battles. A fitting companion for a god who creates corpses wherever he goes. The serpent, symbol of danger and sudden, venomous strikes. And the dog, though not in the cuddly modern sense, but rather in the sense of wild, aggressive pack animals tearing at flesh. These weren't animals of nobility or grace. They were scavengers and predators. His symbols were equally straightforward. Spear for killing at a distance. Sword for close combat when the lines broke and it became personal. Shield for both defense and as a weapon for bashing enemy faces. Helmet and armor, marking him as a warrior god. These weren't complex symbols requiring interpretation. They were the tools of his trade, the instruments of death he wielded with enthusiasm. But Ares didn't fight alone. His companions, those personifications of war's darkness, followed him wherever he went. We've already met Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror made manifest. But let's linger on them a moment longer, because their role in warfare was crucial. Fear is an interesting thing. It's often portrayed as weakness, as something to be overcome. But in battle, fear is rational. It's your brain screaming at you that you're about to die. It's the knowledge that the next spear thrust or arrow or sword swing could end your existence. And when Phobos arrived with his father, that rational fear became overwhelming, paralyzing, all-consuming. Brave men who'd trained their whole lives suddenly couldn't move. Their legs refused to charge. Their hands shook too much to hold weapons. Deimos was different. Where Phobos was the immediate terror of death, Deimos was the dread that came before and after. The sleepless night before battle. The nightmares after seeing your friends die. The slow, crushing weight of knowing you'd have to do it all again tomorrow. Deimos didn't just break you in the moment, he haunted you forever. Together, these two made war not just dangerous, but psychologically devastating. And they were Ares' sons, his pride and joy. He brought them to every battle like a man bringing his children to work. Look, boys, watch Papa turn this organized conflict into a screaming nightmare. Eris, that goddess of discord, deserves more attention too. She wasn't just Ares' companion. She was, in many ways, his enabler. She created the conditions that made his presence possible. A whispered insult here, a perceived slight there, an old grievance dredged up and inflamed. Eris planted seeds of conflict that would blossom into full warfare, and Ares would arrive to reap the bloody harvest. Her most famous act, of course, was starting the Trojan War with that golden apple. For the fairest, it said, and she tossed it right into the middle of the most vain goddesses in existence. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite immediately began arguing over who deserved it. Zeus, wisely wanting nothing to do with that decision, passed the buck to a mortal, Paris of Troy. Paris chose Aphrodite, who'd promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman happened to be Helen, who happened to be already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen went to Troy, either willingly or not, depending on which version you believe, and suddenly Greece was united in a war that would last 10 years and kill thousands. Cities burned, heroes died, an entire civilization collapsed. And Eris? She probably laughed the whole time. That's what she did. She created chaos and watched the world tear itself apart. And Ares was right there beside her, grinning. The ancient sources describe Ares' war cry, as being like the shouts of 10,000 men. Can you imagine hearing that? A sound so loud it seemed like an entire army was screaming at once, and it was coming from a single god. That's the kind of intimidation Ares brought to battle. Raw, overwhelming, inhuman. The kind of sound that makes your blood turn to ice and your bowels turn to water. But here's the paradox that the Greeks recognized, and it's actually kind of funny when you think about it. For all his ferocity, for all his rage and power and terrifying companions, Ares wasn't actually very good at winning battles. He lost constantly. Athena defeated him multiple times. Mortal heroes wounded him. He got trapped in a bronze jar for over a year by two giants and couldn't escape until Hermes rescued him. For a god of war, his win-loss record was, frankly, embarrassing. Why? Because rage and bloodlust, no matter how overwhelming, aren't enough to win battles. You need strategy, planning, coordination, discipline. All the things Athena represented and Ares completely lacked. He would charge in, all fury and aggression, screaming his war cry, swinging his sword, absolutely terrifying. And then he'd get outmaneuvered by someone thinking clearly. It's almost like the Greeks were saying, look, we know the violent emotional aspects of warfare are real and powerful, but they're also inferior. They'll get you killed if you rely on them alone. You need wisdom too. You need Athena as much as, or rather more than, you need Ares. This is why Athena was worshipped widely across Greece, with temples in every major city, while Ares had relatively few cult sites. The Greeks wanted the kind of warfare Athena offered, controlled, purposeful, victorious. They didn't want the chaos Ares brought, even if they acknowledged it existed. But acknowledge it they did, because they couldn't deny reality. Sometimes battles did descend into mindless violence. Sometimes men did lose themselves in bloodlust. Sometimes the noise and confusion and terror were so overwhelming that strategy became impossible and you just had to survive. In those moments, Ares was there, not as a guide or protector, but as the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong. In a way, Ares was the god of war gone bad. The warning about what combat becomes when civilization's restraints fall away, when men stop being soldiers and become killing machines, when honor dies and only survival remains, when the line between hero and murderer blurs and disappears. The ancient Greeks, for all their mythology and religion, were remarkably practical people. They didn't worship Ares because they admired him. They acknowledged him because they had to. War was part of their world, and the terrible aspects of war needed a face, a name, a presence. That presence was Ares. So when warriors made sacrifices to him before battle, they weren't really asking for his favor. They were trying to appease him, to keep him from making things worse than they already were. Please, Ares, if you're going to be here anyway, at least don't turn this into complete chaos. Let there be some sense to the slaughter. Let some of us make it home. And Ares would smile that terrible smile and do exactly as he pleased, because that was his nature. That was his purpose. He was war without redemption, violence without virtue, bloodshed without meaning, the essence of everything the Greeks tried to rise above, and the eternal reminder that they couldn't always succeed, that sometimes, no matter how civilized they became, no matter how much they valued wisdom and restraint, the raw chaos of Ares would break through, and men would die screaming, and nothing would make sense, and the only law would be the law of bronze and blood. That was Ares. That was what he represented, and the Greeks hated him for it, even as they couldn't deny his existence. Of all the stories about Ares, none is more famous or more frequently retold than his affair with Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. It's a tale that has everything: forbidden romance, clever trickery, public humiliation, and a perfect example of opposites attracting in the worst possible way. Let's set the scene. Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, the smith god. Now, this marriage was, let's be honest, problematic from the start. Hephaestus was the master craftsman of Olympus, brilliant with his hands, capable of creating wonders of bronze and gold. But he was also lame, walking with a limp considered ugly by divine standards. Some versions say Hera threw him off Olympus as a baby because she was ashamed of his appearance. Others say Zeus did it in a fit of rage. Either way, Hephaestus didn't have the classical beauty the other gods possessed. Aphrodite, on the other hand, was literally the goddess of beauty. She'd been born from sea foam when Cronus cut off Uranus's, well, let's just say she had a dramatic origin. She was desire personified, so beautiful that mortals and gods alike lost their minds around her. She had an actual magical girdle that made her irresistible to anyone. Giving her to Hephaestus as a wife was like pairing a supermodel with, well, with someone who wasn't conventionally attractive. It was a mismatch, and everyone knew it. The marriage was apparently Zeus's idea, or possibly a reward for Hephaestus freeing Hera from a cursed throne. Either way, Aphrodite wasn't thrilled. Hephaestus was kind to her, devoted, constantly making her gifts. He crafted beautiful jewelry, intricate mirrors, all manner of treasures. But Aphrodite wanted passion, not presence. She wanted excitement, danger, someone who made her heart race. Enter Ares. Now Ares and Aphrodite make a kind of twisted sense as a couple. She was beauty, love, pleasure, creation. He was violence, war, destruction. Opposite forces that somehow completed each other. Love and war have always been intertwined in human experience. The passion of romance and the passion of battle, the way both make your heart pound and your blood sing, the way both can destroy you utterly while making you feel more alive than anything else. Aphrodite was drawn to Ares' strength, his raw masculinity, his danger. Here was a god who didn't bow or scrape or try to win her favor with gifts. He was direct, aggressive, overwhelming. When Ares wanted something, he took it, and what he wanted was her. Ares, for his part, was probably just thrilled that someone didn't immediately recoil from him. Everyone else on Olympus thought he was insufferable. Zeus hated him, the other gods avoided him. But Aphrodite, she looked at all that rage and violence and found it attractive. For a god who was used to disgust and disdain, that must have been intoxicating. So they began an affair, sneaking around behind Hephaestus's back. And they needed to be careful about it, because Hephaestus was, remember, in his workshop constantly, crafting things. They couldn't just stroll into Aphrodite's chambers in broad daylight. This is where Electryon comes in. Electryon was a young man, a companion of Ares, though some sources suggest he was more than just a companion. His job was simple: stand guard outside the door and warn Ares when Helios, the sun god, was about to rise. Because Helios sees everything during the day. His chariot rides across the sky and nothing escapes his notice. So if Ares wanted to sneak around with Aphrodite, he had to do it at night. And he needed someone to tell him when morning was coming, so he could leave before Helios spotted him. This arrangement worked for a while. Ares and Aphrodite would meet in secret. Electryon would keep watch. Dawn would approach, he'd warn them, and Ares would slip away before anyone saw. Perfect crime, really. Except one night, Electryon fell asleep. After weeks or months of staying up all night keeping watch, exhaustion finally caught him. He dozed off at his post, failed to give the warning, and when Helios rode his chariot into the sky and looked down at the world below, he saw Ares and Aphrodite tangled together in bed. Now Helios could have just looked away, could have minded his own business, but no. He went straight to Hephaestus and told him everything. Some versions suggest Helios had his own grudge against Ares. Others say he just thought Hephaestus deserved to know. Either way, the cat was out of the bag and Hephaestus was furious. But Hephaestus was clever. He didn't storm in and confront them immediately. That would have just caused a scene and probably ended with Ares beating him up, because let's be honest, in a straight fight, the smith god was not going to win against the war god. Instead, Hephaestus did what he did best. He crafted something. He made a net. Not just any net, but a magical one, woven from chains so fine they were invisible, yet so strong they could hold even a god. He made it intricate, beautiful in its own way, a masterwork of metallurgy. Then he secretly attached it to the bed where Aphrodite and Ares met, rigging it to the posts and the ceiling, waiting. He told Aphrodite he was taking a trip to Lemnos, his favorite island where he had workshops and forges. He made a big show of leaving, packing his tools, saying goodbye. And the moment he was gone, Ares arrived. This was his chance. Hephaestus was out of town. They had the whole palace, no need to rush. Ares and Aphrodite went to bed together, wrapped in each other's arms. probably thinking they were so clever, so careful, and then the net fell. It dropped over them like invisible spider silk, tightening around their bodies, binding them together in their intimate embrace. They struggled, of course they did, but it was useless. The net held. They were trapped, naked and tangled and completely exposed. And then Hephaestus returned. Because of course he'd never actually left. He'd been waiting for exactly this moment. But Hephaestus didn't confront them privately. Oh no, he summoned the other gods. He called them all to come witness the humiliation of his wife and her lover. "Come see," he cried. "Come see what Aphrodite has done. See how she dishonors her husband with this bloodthirsty brute." The gods came. And here's where the story gets interesting, because their reactions varied. The goddesses, showing some solidarity, or perhaps embarrassment, refused to come look. Hera stayed away. Athena definitely stayed away. She had no interest in seeing her brother in such a state. But the male gods? They came running. Apollo and Hermes showed up. Poseidon was there. Even Zeus apparently came to see what the fuss was about. And they stood there, looking at Ares and Aphrodite, trapped in the net, naked and exposed, caught in the act. Some of the gods laughed. According to Homer, unquenchable laughter arose among the gods. Can you imagine? Ares, the mighty war god, so terrifying on the battlefield, reduced to this, trapped in a net like a fish, tangled up with his lover, unable to even cover himself. It was mortifying, but not everyone laughed. Some of the gods looked at Aphrodite and thought, well, I can see why Ares was willing to risk it. Hermes supposedly said to Apollo, "Would you mind being shamed like this if you could be with Aphrodite?" And Apollo basically said, "Mate, I'd be willing to have 3 times the chains if it meant being with her," which tells you something about divine priorities. Hephaestus demanded recompense. He wanted Ares to pay for the adultery, wanted some kind of justice, but the gods were uncomfortable with the whole situation. Yes, Ares and Aphrodite had wronged Hephaestus, but also, airing this out publicly, trapping them like this, making a spectacle of it. It was all a bit much. Poseidon eventually negotiated a settlement. He told Hephaestus to release them, and he'd personally guarantee that Ares would pay whatever was owed. Hephaestus, perhaps realizing he'd made his point, agreed and released the net. Ares fled immediately. Some versions say he went to Thrace, his supposed homeland, to nurse his wounded pride. Aphrodite fled to Cyprus, to her sacred groves and temples there, to recover from the humiliation. And Electrion? Poor Electrion got transformed into a rooster by an angry Ares, doomed to announce the arrival of the sun every morning for the rest of time. That's why roosters crow at dawn. They're apologizing still for falling asleep on watch that one crucial night. Now, you might think this public humiliation would end the affair. But no, Ares and Aphrodite eventually resumed their relationship. Maybe the drama made it more exciting. Maybe they genuinely loved each other in their own dysfunctional way. Maybe they figured they'd already been caught once and survived it. So what did they have to lose? From their union came several children. We've already met Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror. But they also had Harmonia, goddess of harmony and concord, which is ironic given her parents' chaotic relationship. Harmonia would later marry Cadmus, founder of Thebes, and her wedding would be attended by all the gods, one of the few mortal weddings so honored. They also had Eros, or at least some sources claim Eros was their son. Eros, the god of desire, of that overwhelming need that makes you do foolish things, that makes you risk everything for a moment of passion, that makes you sneak around, break vows, defy consequences. If Eros really was their son, he certainly inherited his parents' passion. What's fascinating about the Ares and Aphrodite story is what it says about the Greeks' understanding of human nature. They recognized that love and war, passion and violence are connected. Both involve intense emotions that override reason. Both can be beautiful and terrible at the same time. Both can destroy you while making you feel more alive than anything else. Aphrodite chose Ares not despite his violence, but because of it. She wasn't interested in the safe, predictable, devoted Hephaestus. She wanted danger. She wanted passion. She wanted someone as intense as herself. And Ares, for all his flaws, was certainly intense. But the story is also a comedy. a farce about divine infidelity that ends in humiliation. The Greeks didn't just tell serious, profound myths. They also told stories that were funny, that showed the gods as flawed and foolish and relatable. Ares and Aphrodite weren't tragic figures here. They were two people who got caught sneaking around and had to face the consequences in the most embarrassing way possible. And yet there's something almost touching about it too. Ares, hated by everyone, found someone who desired him. Aphrodite, married to someone she didn't love, found passion with someone who understood her needs. They hurt Hephaestus, yes, but they also found something real with each other, however messy and complicated it was. The relationship between love and war continues throughout Greek mythology. Aphrodite would continue to influence Ares's actions. During the Trojan War, she'd persuade him to fight for Troy because she supported the Trojans. Ares, who didn't really care which side won, agreed because she asked. Even the god of war, it seemed, could be swayed by love. Or maybe he just couldn't say no to her. After all, she was Aphrodite. Even caught in a net and publicly humiliated, Ares came back for more. That's the power she had. That's the power of desire. It makes you do foolish things, risk everything, and somehow convince yourself it's worth it. And in Ares's case, maybe it was. Because for all the mockery, all the humiliation, at least someone wanted him. At least someone looked at the god everyone else despised and saw something worth having, even if it meant getting caught in an invisible net and laughed at by the entire pantheon. If you thought Ares himself was problematic, wait until you meet his children. Like father, like offspring, as they say, and Ares's progeny were mostly a collection of warriors, monsters, and personifications of everything terrible about conflict. Let's meet the family. We've already discussed Phobos and Deimos at length, but they deserve another moment in the spotlight. These twins, born from Ares's union with Aphrodite, weren't just abstract concepts. In Greek belief, they were actual divine beings who could manifest on battlefields. Warriors would see them or feel their presence, or at least that's what they believed when panic swept through their ranks. Phobos, fear, was often depicted with a lion's head on shields and armor. The idea was that putting his image on your equipment would deflect his power onto your enemies. I carry fear with me, therefore my enemies will feel it, not me. It was sympathetic magic, using the god's own power against others. Of course, it didn't always work, but it made soldiers feel better, and sometimes that psychological edge was enough. Deimos' terror was similar but focused more on that slow creeping dread. Where Phobos struck suddenly, Deimos built over time. He was the nightmares before battle, the shaking hands, the voice in your head saying, "You're going to die today." Together, the twins made warfare psychologically unbearable. The Spartans, interestingly, worshipped Phobos and Deimos specifically. They erected shrines to them, made sacrifices before battles. This might seem counterintuitive. Why worship fear and terror? But the Spartans understood something clever. By acknowledging these forces, by making them allies rather than enemies, they felt they could control them. Fear is on our side, they told themselves. Our enemies will feel it, not us. Whether it worked or not is debatable. But the Spartans did have a reputation for being terrifying in battle, so maybe they were onto something. Then there was Harmonia, the complete opposite of her brothers. The goddess of harmony and concord, she represented peace, balance, and agreement. How two gods as chaotic as Ares and Aphrodite produced a goddess of harmony is one of mythology's great ironies. Maybe it was the universe balancing itself out, or maybe Harmonia was a desperate attempt by love and war to create something beautiful together. Harmonia's story is actually rather tragic. She married Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, in a wedding attended by all the Olympian gods. This was a huge honor, as divine weddings usually didn't involve mortals at all. As a wedding gift, Hephaestus gave Harmonia a beautiful necklace. Because Hephaestus, still bitter about the whole Ares and Aphrodite situation, had cursed the necklace. Anyone who wore it would be plagued by misfortune. And indeed, the necklace brought nothing but tragedy to Harmonia's descendants. Generation after generation of the Theban royal family suffered terrible fates. Oedipus, who killed his father and married his mother, was from this cursed line. The necklace became known as the Necklace of Harmonia, and it remained cursed throughout Greek mythology, a wedding gift that kept on giving grief. But let's move on to some of Ares' other children, because there were quite a few, and most of them were unpleasant. Ares had a whole race of warrior daughters, the Amazons. These legendary female warriors supposedly descended from Ares through various mothers, depending on which source you consult. The Amazons were a civilization of women who lived without men, ruled by queens, and were absolutely formidable in battle. They were expert archers, fierce cavalry riders, and willing to fight to the death. The founder of the Amazons was said to be Otrera, who was either Ares' consort or his daughter. Sources vary. She became the first Amazon queen and bore Ares several daughters who would themselves become famous Amazon queens. Hippolyta was probably the most famous. She was queen of the Amazons and possessed a magical girdle or war belt given to her by her father Ares. This belt symbolized her authority and was said to grant its wearer great strength. Retrieving this girdle became the 9th labor of Heracles. The hero sailed to the land of the Amazons and, well, versions differ on what happened next. In some versions, Hippolyta was so impressed by Heracles that she willingly gave him the belt. In others, the goddess Hera, always looking for ways to make Heracles' life difficult, spread a rumor among the Amazons that Heracles planned to kidnap their queen. The Amazons attacked, Heracles killed Hippolyta in the fighting, and took the belt from her corpse. Either way, it didn't end well for the Amazon queen. Antiope was another Amazon, Hippolyta's sister. She was supposedly abducted by Theseus, the hero of Athens, during Heracles' expedition. Theseus brought her back to Athens and married her, or maybe she fell in love with him and came willingly, depending on who's telling the story. The Amazons, understandably upset about one of their queens being taken, invaded Athens to get her back. In the resulting battle, Antiope was killed, either by her own sister Molpadia by accident, or by other Amazons, or by Theseus defending his city. Greek mythology really liked to make sure Amazon queens died in battle. Penthesilea was yet another Amazon queen, famous for her role in the Trojan War. She came to Troy's aid after the death of Hector, leading a force of Amazon warriors. She fought bravely and killed many Greek soldiers, but she eventually faced Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, and he killed her in single combat. Here's where it gets interesting. According to some versions, the moment Achilles struck the fatal blow and their eyes met, he fell in love with her. Just as she was dying, he realized her beauty and her courage, and he was overwhelmed with grief at what he'd done. When another Greek soldier, Thersites, mocked Achilles for mourning an enemy, Achilles killed him on the spot. Love and war, again, intertwined in the most tragic way. All these Amazon queens, all daughters or granddaughters of Ares, all meeting violent deaths at the hands of Greek heroes. It's almost as if the Greeks were using these stories to work through their anxieties about powerful women who fought like men. The Amazons had to be defeated, had to be killed or married off or otherwise neutralized, because they represented something that challenged the Greek social order. But they were also respected. The Greeks depicted Amazons in their art frequently, showing them as worthy opponents, not mere savages. These warrior women, daughters of the war god, were dangerous and had to be overcome, but they were never dismissed as weak or foolish. Ares had plenty of mortal sons too, and they were generally as violent and unpleasant as you'd expect. Cycnus was one, a son of Ares who built a temple to his father, using the skulls of travelers he'd murdered. He had a habit of waylaying people on the road to Delphi and killing them, adding their skulls to his gruesome temple. Eventually Apollo, whose oracle was at Delphi, got fed up with this and sent Heracles to deal with Cycnus. Heracles killed Cycnus, and Ares, enraged at his son's death, attacked the hero. But Heracles, protected by Athena as always, managed to wound Ares and drive him off. Once again, the war god was defeated, this time by a mortal, and once again Athena was involved in his humiliation. You can see a pattern forming. Diomedes of Thrace was another charming son of Ares. Not to be confused with the Greek hero Diomedes, this Diomedes was a king who owned a herd of man-eating horses. He fed them human flesh, particularly the flesh of strangers and guests who came to his kingdom. Capturing these horses and bringing them back alive was one of Heracles' 12 labors. When Heracles arrived, Diomedes tried to feed him to the horses. Bad idea. Heracles overpowered Diomedes and fed him to his own horses instead, which supposedly calmed them down, proving that maybe what they really needed was some ironic justice in their diet. Heracles then brought the horses back to King Eurystheus, completing the labor. There was also Ascalaphus, one of Ares' sons who actually fought in the Trojan War on the Greek side. He and his brother Ialmenus led the warriors from Orchomenus. Ascalaphus was killed during the fighting, and Ares, watching from Olympus where Zeus had commanded the gods to stay out of the war, went absolutely berserk. He wanted to rush down and avenge his son. Consequences be damned. Athena had to physically restrain him. She grabbed him and told him that if he went down there, he'd just make things worse, and besides, plenty of gods had lost mortal children in this war. He wasn't special. It's a remarkable scene. Athena, the voice of reason as always, holding back her brother from doing something catastrophically stupid while he rages and screams about vengeance. But perhaps Ares' most interesting offspring were the serpents and dragons he fathered. The Ismenian dragon was a massive serpent that guarded the spring of Ares near Thebes. When Cadmus arrived at the site where he would found Thebes, he sent some men to fetch water from the spring. The dragon killed them all. Cadmus tracked down the dragon, and after a fierce battle managed to slay it. Athena then appeared, because of course she did, and told Cadmus to plant the dragon's teeth in the ground. He did, and from the earth sprang fully armed warriors, called the Spartoi, the sown men. These warriors immediately started fighting each other, because apparently being born from dragon teeth makes you incredibly aggressive, and only 5 survived. These 5 became the ancestors of the Theban nobility, which is why Thebans had a reputation for being fierce and warlike. They quite literally descended from warriors spawned by a dragon of Ares. It was in their blood. Cadmus had to serve Ares for 8 years as penance for killing the dragon, and he eventually married Harmonia, Ares' daughter with Aphrodite. So Cadmus killed Ares' dragon son, served time for it, and then married into the family. Greek mythology is wonderfully incestuous and complicated like that. There was also the dragon that guarded the golden fleece in Colchis, which may or may not have been another son of Ares, depending on the source. This dragon never slept, keeping constant watch over the fleece until Jason and Medea came along. Medea used her magic to put the dragon to sleep, and Jason stole the fleece. The dragon's story ended there, though one imagines Ares wasn't happy about another of his children being defeated. Looking at all these children, a pattern emerges. Ares' offspring were generally violent, aggressive, and doomed. His sons became tyrants and monsters who had to be killed by heroes. His daughters became warrior queens who died in battle. Even his divine children, Phobos and Deimos, existed only to spread suffering. The only real exception was Harmonia, and even she ended up cursed through no fault of her own, her marriage gift bringing doom to generations. It's as if, even when Ares tried to create something good, the universe conspired to turn it tragic. This is the legacy of the war god. Not triumph and glory, but violence and death, and the endless cycle of conflict. His children inherited his aggression, but not his immortality, making them vulnerable to the heroes who represented the Greek ideals of measured strength, guided by wisdom. And those heroes, protected by Athena more often than not, cut down Ares' children one by one, proving again and again that brute force alone wasn't enough. That rage without reason was doomed to fail. That the sons and daughters of war, no matter how mighty, would eventually fall to those who fought with purpose and intelligence. It must have been frustrating for Ares, watching his children defeated repeatedly, unable to protect them, because he himself kept losing battles. The mighty war god, father of terror and fear, couldn't even keep his own offspring safe. Perhaps that's another reason Zeus hated him. Not just for his violence and aggression, but for his failure. A god of war who couldn't protect his own children, who couldn't win the battles that mattered, who inspired fear but commanded no respect. The most hated god on Olympus, with a legacy of violence and defeat that stretched across generations. The Trojan War is the centerpiece of Greek mythology, the story that Homer immortalized in the Iliad. The conflict that involved both mortals and gods in a 10-year struggle over Helen, honor, and the fate of civilizations. And Ares, being the god of war, naturally played a role. Or rather, he tried to play a role and ended up embarrassing himself spectacularly. Multiple times. Let's set the stage. The war had been raging for years. Troy, a wealthy city in Asia Minor, was under siege by a massive Greek force. The Greeks wanted Helen back, though really they also wanted Troy's wealth, and the whole thing had become a matter of honor and pride that neither side could back down from. The gods were involved, as they always were in Greek affairs, but they were divided. Some supported the Greeks, others supported Troy, and Zeus had explicitly commanded them not to interfere directly because things were getting out of hand. Athena and Hera supported the Greeks. They hated Troy because of that whole golden apple incident, where Paris had chosen Aphrodite over them in a beauty contest. Holding a grudge for a decade was apparently very much in character for Greek goddesses. Aphrodite naturally supported Troy because Paris had chosen her, and where Aphrodite went, Ares followed. Now here's the thing. Ares had actually promised Hera and Athena that he would support the Greeks. He'd sworn he would help them fight on their side. But then Aphrodite asked him to support Troy instead, and he just changed his mind, broke his word, switched sides. This tells you everything you need to know about Ares. He had no real convictions, no loyalty, no sense of honor. He went where Aphrodite told him to go because he couldn't say no to her. The god of war, supposedly the embodiment of martial courage, let himself be manipulated by his lover. So Ares fought for Troy. He appeared on the battlefield, rallying the Trojan warriors, leading charges, spreading panic among the Greeks with his war cry. For a while, he actually turned the tide of battle. The Trojans, inspired by having a god fight alongside them, pushed the Greeks back toward their ships. It looked like Troy might actually win. But then came Diomedes. Diomedes was a Greek hero, one of the greatest warriors on their side, though he's often overshadowed by Achilles and Ajax in popular retellings. But during his Aristeia, his moment of greatest glory, Diomedes was unstoppable. And Athena, his patron goddess, gave him a special gift, the ability to see gods on the battlefield and distinguish them from mortals. Athena also told Diomedes specifically, "If you see Ares out there, you have my permission to fight him. Don't hold back." Imagine being told by a goddess, "Go ahead and stab my brother, I'm cool with it." So Diomedes, emboldened by Athena's favor, charged across the battlefield looking for Ares. He found the war god fighting among the Trojans, rallying their forces, his spear dripping with Greek blood. And Diomedes, a mortal man, attacked him. Ares, confident in his divine invulnerability, probably didn't even take Diomedes seriously at first. Just another mortal trying to be a hero, about to learn the hard way that you don't fight gods and live to tell about it. Except Athena was there, invisible, standing beside Diomedes, guiding his spear. When Diomedes thrust at Ares, Athena made sure the blow struck true, driving the bronze spear into Ares' side, piercing the divine flesh. Ares screamed. Homer describes it as a sound like 9,000 or 10,000 men roaring in battle, an inhuman shriek of pain and rage that echoed across the entire battlefield. Both Greeks and Trojans stopped fighting for a moment, stunned by the noise, looking around to see what could possibly make such a sound. And there was Ares, the mighty god of war, wounded, bleeding ichor, the golden blood of the gods clutching his side. He turned and fled, just abandoned the battlefield, left the Trojans he'd been leading, and flew straight back to Olympus like a child running home to daddy after getting beaten up. He burst into Zeus's presence, whining about what had happened. Athena had helped a mortal wound him. It wasn't fair. He was hurt. Do something. Zeus looked at his least favorite son and basically told him to shut up and stop whining. "You're the most hateful of all my children," Zeus said. "All you love is fighting and discord. You get that from your mother. If you weren't my own son, I'd have thrown you into Tartarus long ago, down with the Titans. Now stop sniveling. You asked for this when you went down there to fight." Even wounded and bleeding, Ares couldn't get sympathy from his own father. Zeus called Paeon, the physician of the gods, to heal the wound, but there was no comfort, no reassurance, just disgust at Ares' behavior. Meanwhile, back on the battlefield, the Greeks were emboldened. If a mortal man could wound Ares with a goddess's help, then what else was possible? The tide turned again, this time in favor of the Greeks. But that wasn't Ares' only humiliation during the Trojan War. Oh no, there was more to come. Later in the war, Ares' son Ascalaphus was killed by a Trojan spear. Ares, watching from Olympus, where Zeus had commanded all the gods to stay out of the fighting, lost his mind. His son was dead, his own flesh and blood killed down there while Ares was forced to watch. He tried to charge down to the battlefield to avenge Ascalaphus. He grabbed his armor, shouted his war cry, prepared to descend and slaughter every Trojan he could find. Zeus's orders be damned. Athena once again had to stop him. She grabbed him physically, held him back, told him he was being an idiot. If you go down there against Zeus's direct command, you'll make everything worse. Every other god has lost children in this war. You're not special. Sit down and grieve like everyone else. The image of Athena physically restraining her enraged brother while he struggles and screams is almost comical. The goddess of wisdom versus the god of rage, reason versus emotion, and once again, reason wins. Ares eventually calmed down. Or rather, he gave up, because he wasn't going to overpower Athena, and he knew Zeus would punish him if he disobeyed. So he sat there on Olympus, seething, while his son's body lay unburied on the field below. Later still, near the end of the war, Zeus finally gave the gods permission to join the fighting directly. The Olympians immediately divided into two armies and clashed on the plains of Troy, gods fighting gods while mortals scattered out of the way. And once again Ares fought Athena. Once again he lost. This time Athena didn't even use a weapon. She picked up a large rock, because apparently that's all you need to defeat Ares, and hurled it at him. The rock struck him in the neck, and he went down, crashing to the ground. His divine body sprawled across 7 acres of land, according to Homer's description. 7 acres. That's how humiliating it was. Ares was laid out flat, taking up 7 acres of battlefield, while Athena stood over him victorious. Aphrodite tried to help him. She rushed to his side, trying to lead him away from the battle, helping him to his feet. But Hera saw this and told Athena to go stop Aphrodite from rescuing Ares. So Athena attacked Aphrodite too. She punched the goddess of love in the chest, and both Aphrodite and Ares went down in a heap, tangled together, defeated, humiliated. The two lovers, love and war, both beaten by wisdom. It's almost poetic. When Ares finally recovered and fled the battlefield again, going back to Olympus nursing his wounds, the Trojans' spirits broke. They'd seen their divine protector defeated twice by the same goddess. They'd seen Athena dominate the war god like he was nothing. And if gods could lose, what hope did mortals have? The Trojan War ended shortly after, with the famous trick of the wooden horse, a strategic deception that was pure Athena. The Greeks won through intelligence, patience, and clever planning, everything Ares lacked. Looking back on Ares' role in the Trojan War, it's a masterclass in humiliation. He switched sides on a whim, breaking his oath. He was wounded by a mortal with Athena's help. He was prevented from avenging his son. He was defeated in direct combat with his sister, not once but twice. He was knocked unconscious by a rock. He needed Aphrodite to help him off the battlefield. For the god of war, it was a complete disaster. And the Greeks listening to Homer recite the Iliad would have understood the message clearly. Rage and violence alone aren't enough. You need wisdom. You need strategy. You need Athena, not Ares. The war god, for all his power and fury, was inferior to the wisdom goddess. And in a culture that valued the intellect as much as Greece did, that was the ultimate judgment on Ares' character. He was strong, yes, fierce, certainly, but ultimately ineffective, ultimately foolish, ultimately beaten by anyone who kept their head and fought smart. The most hated god on Olympus proved right in his failure on the most famous battlefield in all of mythology. The Trojan War wasn't the only time Ares was humiliated in Greek mythology. In fact, getting defeated became something of a recurring theme for him. Let's explore some of his other embarrassing moments, because apparently the Greeks never got tired of telling stories about the war god failing at his job. Perhaps the most famous non-Trojan War humiliation comes from the story of the Aloadae, two giant brothers named Otus and Ephialtes. These weren't just any giants. They were the sons of Poseidon, and they grew at an incredible rate. By the time they were 9 years old, they were each over 50 feet tall and correspondingly strong. Being teenagers with too much power and not enough sense, they decided to storm Mount Olympus and overthrow the gods. Their plan was ambitious: stack Mount Pelion on top of Mount Ossa, climb up, and assault Olympus directly. It was like a cosmic ladder made of mountains. Before they did that, though, they decided to practice on some of the gods, and they chose Ares as their first victim, probably because they figured he'd be a good challenge, being the war god and all. They were right about that. Ares fought them fiercely, but there were two of them. They were massive, and apparently they were clever enough to coordinate their attacks. They overpowered him, bound him in chains, and stuffed him into a bronze jar. Let me repeat that. Two mortal giants captured the god of war and put him in a jar. Not just any jar, mind you. A bronze pithos, a large storage vessel, the kind of thing you'd use for storing grain or wine. Except instead of grain or wine, it held a very angry, very trapped god of war. And there Ares stayed, for 13 months. Over a year he was imprisoned in that jar, unable to break free, unable to call for help, just stuck in bronze darkness while the world went on without him. The giants kept him as a trophy, probably bragging about how they'd captured a god. Meanwhile, on Olympus, the other gods eventually noticed Ares was missing. His absence wasn't exactly mourned, one imagines, but eventually someone asked, "Hey, where's Ares? Haven't seen him causing problems lately." The giant's stepmother, Eriboea, knew about Ares's imprisonment, but apparently wasn't keen on her stepson's god-napping hobby. She told Hermes, the messenger god, where Ares was being kept. Hermes, perhaps finding the whole situation darkly amusing, went and freed Ares from the jar. Ares emerged weak, exhausted, barely able to stand after 13 months of imprisonment. The experience had nearly destroyed him. If Hermes had arrived much later, Ares might have actually died, or whatever passes for death when a god wastes away from neglect. The giants, for their part, were eventually killed by Apollo and Artemis through trickery. Apollo transformed himself into a deer and ran between the brothers while they were hunting. Both threw their spears at the deer simultaneously, but Apollo vanished and the spears struck the brothers instead, killing them. But the damage to Ares' reputation was done. The mighty war god, captured and imprisoned in a jar by two mortal giants. For over a year. It became one of those stories that people whispered and giggled about. Remember when Ares got stuffed in a jar? Classic. Then there were his repeated conflicts with Heracles, the greatest of the Greek heroes. Heracles was actually Ares' enemy several times, usually because Heracles kept killing Ares' children. First, there was Sickness, that charming fellow who built a temple to Ares using the skulls of murdered travelers. When Heracles killed him, Ares attacked the hero in a rage. The two fought, but Heracles, under Athena's protection as always, managed to wound Ares and drive him off. Once again, a mortal defeated the war god. Later, Heracles had to capture the man-eating horses of Diomedes, another son of Ares. After feeding Diomedes to his own horses, which seems to have been Heracles' solution to a surprising number of problems, he brought the horses back successfully, adding another dead son of Ares to his tally. And then there was Hippolyta and the Amazon expedition, where, depending on the version, Heracles either negotiated for the girdle, or killed Hippolyta and took it, or sparked a battle that led to her death. Either way, another of Ares' children died because of Heracles, and Ares could do nothing about it. Because here's the thing, Heracles was under Zeus's protection. He was Zeus's son, after all, from one of Zeus's many affairs, and Zeus had decreed that Heracles' labors must be completed. So every time Ares tried to interfere, every time he tried to avenge one of his children, he'd face the wrath of Zeus himself. Ares must have been incredibly frustrated. His children kept dying at the hands of this hero, and he couldn't do anything about it without defying his father. And we've already established that Zeus hated Ares and would have been thrilled to have an excuse to punish him. So Ares had to watch, impotent and furious as Heracles systematically killed his offspring one after another. Another humiliation in a long list of humiliations. But my personal favorite Ares humiliation story doesn't involve grand battles or famous heroes. It involves Athena, naturally, and it's almost casual in how dismissive it is of Ares's power. During one of the many conflicts between gods, Ares came at Athena in a rage, probably over something she'd said or done to embarrass him yet again. He attacked with his full power, determined to finally defeat his sister, who'd humiliated him so many times. Athena didn't even draw a weapon. She just stood there, calm as always, and when Ares got close enough, she slapped him. Not punched, not struck with a spear or sword. Slapped him. An open-handed slap across the face, the kind of dismissive blow you'd use on an annoying child. And Ares went down, knocked flat by a slap. The story is told briefly, almost as an aside in some texts, which somehow makes it worse. It wasn't even important enough to warrant a detailed account. Just, and then Athena slapped Ares and he fell down. And the story moves on to more interesting gods. Can you imagine? The god of war defeated by a slap. Not even a proper warrior's blow, but a contemptuous slap that said more clearly than words ever could. You're beneath me. You're not even worth fighting properly. These stories had a purpose beyond entertainment, though they were certainly entertaining. They taught Greek audiences that brute force, aggression and violence without control weren't virtues to be admired. They were flaws to be overcome. Every time Ares was defeated, it was by someone who represented something the Greeks valued more than mere martial prowess. Athena was wisdom and strategy. Heracles was a hero who completed impossible tasks through cleverness as much as strength. Even the giants who captured him did so through teamwork and planning. Ares, fighting alone, relying only on rage and power, lost again and again. He was the cautionary tale, the example of what not to be, the god who should have been mighty but was instead a punchline, and the Greeks never let him forget it. Every retelling of these stories, every performance of the Iliad, every vase painting showing Athena defeating Ares drove the message home. Violence alone will get you beaten. Rage alone will get you humiliated. Power without wisdom is just waiting to be defeated by someone smarter. The most hated god on Olympus, and the most frequently defeated. His failures becoming lessons for mortals on how not to approach conflict. Given everything we've learned about Ares, his unpopularity with other gods, his constant defeats, his violent nature, you might be surprised to learn that he was actually worshipped in ancient Greece. Not widely, not enthusiastically, but worshipped nonetheless. Because however much the Greeks disliked what Ares represented, they couldn't deny that war was part of their world. Ares's cult sites were relatively rare compared to other Olympians. You didn't find major temples to Ares in every city like you did for Athena or Apollo. His worship was concentrated in certain areas, particularly in the north, in regions like Thrace, which the Greeks considered barbaric and uncivilized. The implication was clear. Ares was a foreign god, not really one of theirs, worshipped by people who didn't know better. But even in mainland Greece, Ares had some cult centers, particularly in Sparta and the surrounding region of Laconia. The Spartans, being the most militaristic of all Greek city-states, had a more complicated relationship with Ares than other Greeks. They recognized that his raw aggression, his love of battle, was part of what made them effective warriors. But even they tempered it with discipline and training. One fascinating tradition in Sparta involved a statue of Ares bound in chains. The statue was kept in the temple of Enyalius, who was either another name for Ares or a god closely associated with him. The chains symbolized that the power of war should be kept in the city, prevented from running wild. Victory should stay with Sparta, not wander off to help their enemies. Other Greek cities had similar traditions of binding or restraining images of Ares. It was a form of sympathetic magic. By binding the god's image, they hoped to control war itself, to keep it contained and directed according to their needs, rather than letting it run wild. This tells you something important about Greek attitudes toward Ares. They didn't worship him the way they worshipped other gods, with love or devotion or hope for blessings. They worshipped him the way you'd appease a dangerous animal, with caution and restraint, trying to keep him under control. Sacrifices to Ares were typically made before battles, but again the intent was different from other gods. Warriors weren't praying for Ares' blessing or asking him to fight on their side. They were asking him not to make things worse. Please, Ares, if you must be present, at least don't turn this into complete chaos. The animals sacrificed to Ares were typically dogs and sometimes horses. Both were associated with war in ancient Greece, but they were also considered somewhat savage, not the clean, noble cattle or sheep offered to gods like Zeus or Athena. The very nature of the sacrifice reflected Ares' status as a lesser, more brutal god. In Athens, there was a famous hill called the Areopagus, which translates to Hill of Ares. This might sound like an honor, but the hill was actually the site of Athens' murder court. According to myth, Ares had been tried there for killing Halirrhothius, a son of Poseidon who had raped Ares' daughter Alcippe. The gods acquitted Ares, ruling that the killing was justified as defense of his daughter. So the Hill of Ares became associated with justice, particularly justice for violent crimes. Not exactly a flattering association for the war god. His name was attached to a place where people were tried for murder, where violence was judged and punished. Even his moments of justified action became cautionary tales about the consequences of bloodshed. In some parts of Asia Minor, particularly in regions that had been more recently Hellenized, Ares was actually worshipped more prominently. He even had oracular functions in some places, which is interesting because that wasn't typically part of his character in mainland Greece. Perhaps these were local war gods who were syncretized with Ares when Greek culture spread eastward, keeping their original importance but adopting Greek names. Ancient authors noted that some cities held annual festivals where Ares was symbolically bound or detained as their protector. They would perform rituals meant to ensure that war stayed with them, that Ares' power served their city rather than their enemies. It was a strange kind of worship, more like contract negotiation than devotion. The Scythians, a nomadic people north of Greece, supposedly worshipped a god equivalent to Ares and made human sacrifices to him. They would kill one in every 100 prisoners of war as an offering. The Greeks reported this with a kind of horrified fascination, seeing it as proof that Ares worship, taken to its extreme, led to barbarism and savagery. Whether the Scythians actually did this, or whether this was Greek propaganda about savage northerners, is debatable. But the fact that Greeks associated Ares with human sacrifice, the most barbaric religious practice they could imagine, tells you everything about how they viewed him. Even in art, Ares was portrayed differently from other gods. Zeus appeared majestic and kingly, Apollo was beautiful and refined, Athena was wise and dignified, Ares was just armed. He wore armor, held weapons, sometimes stood in aggressive poses, but there wasn't much personality or character to him in visual representations. It's as if the artists couldn't really figure out how to portray him beyond generic warrior god. He was violence personified, which doesn't leave much room for nuance or distinctive characteristics. He was scary because he was armed and aggressive, not because he had any particular gravitas or divine authority. This is in stark contrast to how other war deities were portrayed. Athena had her owl, her olive branch, her wise expression. She was recognizable as the goddess of wisdom even when fully armed. Ares was just a guy with weapons, intimidating, sure, but not particularly interesting or inspiring. The poets didn't help his reputation. In the Homeric hymn to Ares, which is actually a late composition possibly written in Roman times, Ares is called exceeding in strength and shield-bearer and mighty with the spear. But even this supposedly flattering hymn feels perfunctory, like going through the motions of praising a god nobody really likes. Compare that to the Homeric hymn to Athena, which gushes about her wisdom, her birth from Zeus's head, her role as protector of cities, her gifts to humanity. Or the hymns to Apollo, which celebrate his beauty, his music, his role as god of prophecy and healing. Those hymns are full of genuine admiration and devotion. The hymn to Ares feels like it's trying to find nice things to say about someone you're required to compliment. Ares is strong, he has a shield, his spear is mighty, he's really good at violence. In the end, Ares' worship in ancient Greece was minimal, reluctant, and focused primarily on containment rather than celebration. The Greeks acknowledged him because they had to acknowledge that war existed, but they didn't love him for it. They gave him small temples in out-of-the-way places, made quick sacrifices before battles, told stories about how he kept losing to Athena, and generally treated him as a necessary evil rather than a beloved god. And Ares, one imagines, noticed this. He saw the grand temples to Zeus, the celebrations for Dionysus, the devotion to Athena. He saw how other gods were loved and honored, while he was merely feared and occasionally appeased. But what could he do about it? He was what he was. The god of war, of bloodlust and violence, of everything the Greeks tried to rise above. He couldn't change his nature any more than Athena could stop being wise or Apollo could stop being beautiful. So he remained the most hated god on Olympus, worshipped by necessity rather than desire, honored not with love but with chains, his temples few and his devotees fewer, the god nobody really wanted but everyone had to acknowledge. Here's where things get really interesting. When the Romans conquered Greece and adopted their mythology, they didn't just copy the gods wholesale. They transformed them, gave them new characteristics, made them fit Roman values. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than with Ares. The Romans called him Mars, and Mars was everything Ares wasn't. First and foremost, Mars was respected, beloved even. He was one of the most important gods in the Roman pantheon, second only to Jupiter in military importance. He had major temples throughout Rome, festivals in his honor, and a month named after him. March, or Martius, was Mars's month, marking the beginning of both the military campaign season and the agricultural year. See, Mars wasn't just a war god to the Romans. He was also an agricultural deity, protecting crops and livestock. This dual nature, warrior and farmer, reflected Roman values perfectly. Romans saw themselves as citizen soldiers, men who worked the land in peace, but took up arms when needed. Mars embodied that ideal. But more than that, Mars was the father of Rome itself. According to Roman legend, Mars had an affair with Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, princess of the ancient city of Alba Longa. The affair resulted in twin sons, Romulus and Remus. The boys were supposed to be killed because Vestal virgins were required to remain chaste, and their existence was proof of Rhea Silvia's violation of that vow. But they were abandoned instead, suckled by a she-wolf, and eventually grew up to found the city of Rome. Romulus became the first king, gave the city his name, and established the institutions that would eventually lead to Roman greatness. So every Roman, in a sense, was descended from Mars. He was their divine ancestor, their patron, their protector. When Roman legions marched to war, they marched under Mars's protection. When they expanded their empire, they did so in Mars's name. He wasn't just the god of violence and chaos like Ares. He was the god who secured victory, who protected Rome's people, who ensured the city's dominance. The Romans even gave Mars a different personality. He was disciplined, strategic, honorable. He fought not for the love of battle, but to secure peace through victory. The phrase, peace through strength, could have been Mars's motto. He represented military power as a tool of statecraft, not an end in itself. Compare this to Ares, who fought because he liked fighting, who switched sides on a whim, who cared nothing for causes or consequences. Mars had purpose. Mars had dignity. Mars won. The Romans also emphasized Mars's relationship with Venus, their version of Aphrodite. But where the Greek story focused on adultery and humiliation, the Roman version was more romantic. Venus and Mars were lovers, yes, but they represented the union of love and war, beauty and strength, pleasure and duty. Their relationship wasn't scandalous, it was idealized. Roman art depicted Mars and Venus together frequently, often in intimate but not lewd poses. Mars would be removing his armor, Venus would be offering him a gift, and the whole scene would speak to the idea that even warriors needed love, that strength should be balanced with gentleness. The famous affair with Vulcan, Hephaestus catching them, was still told, but the emphasis changed. It became less about humiliation and more about the inevitable triumph of passion over propriety. The Romans, being somewhat more pragmatic about affairs and sexuality than the Greeks, saw it less as a scandal and more as a story about human nature. Mars also had epithets that reflected different aspects of his character. Mars Gradivus, the marching god, who led armies into battle. Mars Quirinus, the peaceful aspect, protector of the Roman state in times of peace. Mars Pater, Mars the Father, emphasizing his role as divine ancestor. Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, who punished Rome's enemies. Each epithet captured a different facet of how Romans saw warfare and military power. It wasn't just about violence. It was about discipline, honor, protection, and justice. All things Ares utterly lacked. The Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, was a large open area in Rome used for military training, assemblies, and eventually public buildings. It was sacred to Mars, and remained so throughout Roman history. The importance given to this space showed how central Mars was to Roman identity. Festivals to Mars were major events in the Roman calendar. The Aquaria, held in late February and again in mid-March, involved horse races in Mars's honor. The Armilustrium in October marked the end of the campaign season, when weapons were ritually purified and stored for winter. These weren't grim, fearful occasions. They were celebrations of military success and preparations for future victories. Roman soldiers swore oaths to Mars. Generals made sacrifices to him before campaigns. Victories were dedicated to him. He wasn't just acknowledged reluctantly like Ares. He was actively embraced as a patron and protector. Why the difference? Why did Romans love Mars while Greeks hated Ares? Part of it was cultural. Rome was a militaristic society in a way that even Sparta wasn't. Their entire state was organized around military expansion and conquest. They valued discipline, hierarchy, and the subjugation of individual desires to collective goals. Mars, representing disciplined military power in service of the state, fit that worldview perfectly. The Greeks, by contrast, valued individual excellence and intellectual achievement as much as or more than military conquest. They preferred the clever Odysseus over the straightforward Ajax, the wise Athena over the brutal Ares. Their city-states fought each other constantly, but also produced philosophy, art, drama, and science. War was part of Greek life, but not the defining feature. The Romans also needed Mars to be respectable, because they used him for propaganda. As they conquered the Mediterranean, they justified their expansion as bringing peace, order, and civilization to barbarians. Mars wasn't bringing chaos. He was bringing Roman law and order, backed by military might. That required a more dignified war god than the bloodthirsty Ares. So when the Romans adopted Greek mythology, they kept the basic framework, the stories, the genealogies, but they fundamentally changed the character. Ares the hated became Mars the beloved. The god of mindless violence became the god of righteous conquest. The deity who lost constantly became the divine ancestor of history's most successful military power. It's one of the most dramatic transformations in all of Greco-Roman mythology. Same god, same basic role, completely different perception. And it worked. Mars remained important in Roman religion and culture throughout the empire's history. Even as Christianity spread and the old gods faded, Mars held on longer than most because military power remained central to Roman identity. In later Western art and literature, the two versions of the god merged. By the Renaissance, artists were depicting Mars with characteristics drawn from both traditions, sometimes foolish and defeated like Ares, sometimes noble and victorious like Mars. The distinction blurred as the centuries passed, but for the Romans themselves there was no confusion. Mars was not Ares. Mars was better. Mars was theirs. Mars had fathered their city, protected their legions, ensured their conquest of the known world. He was the god who proved that military power, properly directed, could build empires. And somewhere in whatever divine realm gods inhabit, one imagines Ares looking at Mars with mixed feelings. Pride, perhaps, that he'd finally gotten respect, even if it required adopting a new name and personality. Jealousy, certainly, that it took becoming Roman for him to be loved. And maybe a bit of wistfulness for the simpler days when he was just the god of violence, hated but at least consistent, before propaganda and statecraft complicated his divine identity. The most hated god, reborn as the most honored, the greatest transformation in mythology, and the final proof that sometimes a change of culture is all you need to turn a villain into a hero. So what happened to Ares after the ancient world faded? Did he vanish along with the temples and sacrifices? Did he disappear when Christianity swept across Europe and the old gods were dismissed as demons or delusions? Not exactly. Gods don't really die in the cultural sense. They transform, they linger, they find new ways to remain relevant. And Ares, for all his failures in mythology, had a quality that kept him alive in human imagination. He represented something eternal about human nature. War didn't end with the fall of Rome or the rise of Christianity. Violence didn't disappear. Rage, fear, bloodlust, they all remained part of the human experience. And so Ares remained too, not as a god to be worshipped, but as an archetype, a symbol, a way of understanding the darkest aspects of conflict. During the Middle Ages, when Christianity dominated Europe, the old gods were officially rejected. Temples were destroyed or converted to churches. Rituals were banned. The clergy taught that the Greek and Roman gods had been either demons or mere fictions, unworthy of belief. But the story survived. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving Homer and Virgil and Ovid. Educated people still read the classics, still knew the myths, and Ares lurked in those pages, a reminder of pagan times when gods embodied human impulses rather than divine perfection. Medieval writers sometimes used Ares or Mars as a symbol in allegorical works. In dream visions and romances, a figure representing war or violence might appear, clearly modeled on the old war god. These weren't religious texts. They were using mythological figures as literary devices, ways to personify abstract concepts. Then came the Renaissance and everything changed. Suddenly, classical learning was fashionable again. Artists and writers looked back to Greece and Rome for inspiration, and the gods, including Ares, returned to prominence. Renaissance art depicts Mars Ares frequently, often in scenes with Venus Aphrodite. But the tone had shifted from the ancient versions. Artists like Botticelli painted Mars and Venus, showing the war god asleep, disarmed by love, while Venus watches over him. It's a scene about love conquering war, about peace triumphing over violence. Other artists showed Mars in his armor, ready for battle, representing the military values of Renaissance city-states. Donatello's David shows the young hero with his foot on Goliath's head. But some versions include subtle references to Athena defeating Ares, drawing parallels between the biblical and mythological stories of clever underdogs defeating brute force. As Europe moved into the Enlightenment and then the modern era, Ares became more of a psychological symbol than a religious one. Writers used him to explore themes of violence, aggression, and the dark side of human nature. In the 19th century, as psychology emerged as a field, thinkers began using mythological figures to describe mental states and personality types. The Ares personality became shorthand for aggressive, impulsive, violence-prone individuals. Someone who solved problems with aggression rather than reason, who acted on anger without thinking through consequences. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the Dionysian impulse versus the Apollonian, but he could just as easily have contrasted Ares and Athena, rage versus reason, chaos versus order. The war god remained relevant as a way to talk about fundamental human conflicts between our rational and emotional sides. The 20th century, with its unprecedented wars and violence, saw renewed interest in Ares as a symbol. The world wars, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, these horrors demanded explanation. And people looked back to mythology for ways to comprehend incomprehensible violence. Ares became a symbol of war's brutality, the mindless destruction that modern industrialized conflict brought. When poets wrote about the trenches of World War I or the bombings of World War II, they evoked Ares, the god of senseless slaughter, the embodiment of battle's worst aspects. Psychologists, particularly Jungians, identified Ares as an archetype in the collective unconscious. He represented the warrior aspect of the male psyche, the aggressive, protective, violence-capable part. But without wisdom to guide it, without Athena's influence, that warrior energy became destructive and self-defeating. Modern therapists sometimes use the Ares archetype to help clients understand their own aggressive impulses. You're channeling your inner Ares, they might say. But remember what happened to him in the myths. Rage without wisdom leads to defeat. In popular culture, Ares made a significant comeback. Marvel Comics featured Ares as a character in their universe, depicting him as a brutal anti-hero who eventually tried to be better for the sake of his son. DC Comics made him a recurring villain in Wonder Woman stories, the war god opposing the Amazon princess who represented love and truth. The God of War video game series put Ares front and center, though they took significant liberties with the mythology. In the games, Ares is a villain, manipulating the protagonist Kratos into terrible acts, embodying the destructive nature of war and vengeance. When Kratos kills Ares and becomes the new god of war, he finds that the violence doesn't bring peace, only more suffering. It's a modern retelling of ancient themes. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series features Ares as a character too, depicted as a biker god, aggressive and unpleasant, but occasionally useful. Riordan captured the essential Ares perfectly, powerful, dangerous, mostly unlikable, but still part of the mythological world the characters inhabit. Movies have used Ares as well. In the 2017 Wonder Woman film, Ares is the hidden villain, manipulating humanity into endless conflicts. The film's message, that humanity doesn't need a god to be violent, but that love and compassion can overcome war, echoes ancient Greek values about wisdom defeating mindless aggression. There's even a scientific legacy. Ares gave his name to Areopagus Hill, and the NASA Mars rovers have explored the planet named after his Roman counterpart. More directly, when astronomer Asaph Hall discovered 2 moons orbiting Mars in 1877, he named them Phobos and Deimos after Ares' sons. Fear and terror orbiting the war planet, visible reminders of mythology every time we look at Mars through a telescope. In psychology, the Ares complex is sometimes used to describe individuals who are drawn to conflict, who can't seem to find peace, who need the adrenaline and intensity of confrontation to feel alive. It's not an official diagnosis, but it's a useful shorthand for a particular personality type that's been recognized since ancient times. Modern pacifist movements have used Ares as a symbol of what they oppose. Anti-war posters have depicted the war god as a skeleton or monster, representing death and destruction. Say no to Ares becomes say no to war, the ancient god standing in for modern military-industrial complexes and geopolitical violence. But Ares has also been reclaimed by some as a symbol of necessary aggression. Men's groups focused on healthy masculinity sometimes invoke Ares as representing protective violence, the warrior spirit used in service of defense rather than conquest. They argue that Ares wasn't evil, just undisciplined, and that channeling warrior energy with wisdom, adding Athena's influence, creates balanced strength. In literature, modern retellings of Greek myths often give Ares more nuance than ancient sources did. Some portray him sympathetically, as a god struggling with his nature, hated by family, trying to find meaning in a world that despises what he is. Others lean into the violence, making him a villain representing toxic masculinity and uncontrolled aggression. The internet age has kept Ares relevant too. Memes comparing Athena and Ares, the brain versus brawn trope, remain popular. Strategy games often feature Ares or Mars as war deities you can invoke for military bonuses. Role-playing games include clerics or paladins of Ares as character options, usually chaotic or aggressive builds. There's even been academic study of how Ares has been portrayed across different eras, how his character reflects changing attitudes toward violence and war. Scholars have written entire books analyzing what his unpopularity in Greek culture versus his prominence in Roman culture tells us about those civilizations' values. What's remarkable is that Ares has remained relevant for over 2,500 years. He's never been as popular as other gods. He's never been the hero of stories. But he's always been there, lurking in the background, representing something uncomfortable but true about human nature. We want to be Athena, wise and strategic and righteous, but sometimes we're Ares, angry and violent and ruled by emotion. We want to believe that reason guides our conflicts, but often it's rage and fear and bloodlust that determine outcomes. Ares won't die as long as war exists. He won't be forgotten as long as humans struggle with aggression, violence, and the darkest aspects of conflict. He's the god nobody wants, but everyone recognizes, the divine embodiment of everything we hope to overcome, but fear we never will. And maybe that's his ultimate legacy, not as a figure to worship or admire, but as a mirror showing us the parts of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge, the rage we pretend we don't feel, the violence we claim to abhor while being drawn to it, the chaos we create while convincing ourselves we're fighting for order. The most hated god, but perhaps the most honest one too, because Athena might represent who we want to be, but Ares represents who we sometimes are, when fear and anger override everything else, when the world narrows to us versus them, when nothing matters except survival and victory. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, has kept him alive through millennia, from ancient Greek battlefields to modern movie screens, from Homer's epics to video game consoles, always there, always relevant, always reminding us that wisdom must struggle eternally against rage, and the outcome is never guaranteed. So here we are at the end of our journey through the blood-soaked world of Ares. What have we learned about the god of war, bloodlust, and battle? We've learned that he was born to power but squandered every advantage. Son of Zeus and Hera, brother to Athena, part of the Olympian elite, yet hated by his father, dismissed by his siblings, tolerated rather than loved. A god who should have been magnificent, but became a cautionary tale instead. We've learned that he represented the darkest aspects of warfare, not the strategic brilliance of planned campaigns, but the mindless chaos of battle gone wrong, the screaming, the blood, the terror, the moment when formations break and every man fights alone. Everything the Greeks valued about war was Athena. Everything they feared was Ares. We've learned about his scandalous affair with Aphrodite, the union of love and war that ended in public humiliation, but somehow endured anyway. We've met his children, a collection of terrors and warriors and personifications of everything awful about conflict. Fear, terror, violence all descended from the war god and his consort. We've witnessed his failures in the Trojan War, wounded by a mortal, defeated by his sister, prevented from avenging his son, reduced to a punchline in the most famous story in Greek mythology. We've seen him captured by giants, stuffed in a jar, slapped down by Athena, and generally humiliated at every turn. We've explored his limited worship, how the Greeks acknowledged him because they had to but never loved him, never built grand temples, never celebrated his festivals with joy, how they bound his statues in chains, hoping to contain his power, to keep war under control rather than letting it run wild. And we've seen his transformation into Mars, how the Romans took this hated god and made him beloved, respectable, dignified, how a change in culture turned the god of mindless violence into the divine father of Rome itself, proving that sometimes context is everything. Ares is a paradox, powerful but ineffective, feared but mocked, essential but despised. He's a god who represents something real about human nature, but also everything we hope to overcome. He's honest in a way other gods aren't, showing us the ugly truth about violence without dressing it up in nobility or righteousness. In a pantheon full of flawed gods, Ares might be the most tragically flawed of all. Not because he was evil, that's too simple, but because he was limited. He had one note, one song, one purpose: violence. And while that was sometimes necessary, it was never sufficient. It was never enough to win respect, to earn love, to be anything more than a necessary evil. The Greeks understood something profound about war through Ares. They recognized that the violent, emotional, chaotic aspects of conflict were real and powerful, but they also recognized that relying on those aspects alone was a path to failure. You needed wisdom too. You needed strategy, planning, restraint, purpose. You needed Athena to balance Ares, reason to guide rage. Every time Ares appeared in myth and was defeated, it reinforced this lesson. Rage alone isn't enough. Power alone isn't enough. You need more than just the willingness to fight. You need the wisdom to know when to fight, how to fight, and why you're fighting. And in a world that's seen the horrors of industrialized warfare, nuclear weapons, and conflicts that can destroy civilizations, that ancient Greek wisdom feels more relevant than ever. We have the power to wage war on an unprecedented scale. But do we have the wisdom to avoid it? Do we have the strategy to win without destroying ourselves? Do we have the restraint to use force only when necessary? These are questions Ares forces us to ask, not through his victories, he didn't have many of those, but through his failures, his defeats, his constant humiliations at the hands of wiser gods and clever heroes. He shows us what happens when violence becomes an end in itself, when rage drives action, when bloodlust replaces thought. The most hated god on Olympus, but also perhaps one of the most important, because he represents the eternal struggle between our worst impulses and our better nature, between the chaos of war and the order of civilization, between the screaming rage that says destroy everything and the quiet wisdom that says there must be a better way. And that struggle continues today. Ares hasn't gone anywhere. He's still with us in every conflict, every moment of rage, every time fear and violence threaten to overwhelm reason. He's the voice that says, hit first, think later, that glorifies strength over wisdom, that sees every problem as something to be solved with force. But Athena is still here too. And the choice between them, between rage and wisdom, between Ares and Athena, that's the choice we make every day, individually and collectively whenever we're faced with conflict. The Greeks made their choice clear in their myths. Athena defeats Ares every time. Wisdom beats rage, strategy trumps chaos, purpose defeats meaningless violence. May we be wise enough to remember that lesson. May we choose Athena over Ares, wisdom over rage, thought over impulse. May we recognize the war god's voice when he whispers in our ears and have the strength to reject his counsel. Because in the end, the story of Ares is a warning about what happens when we let our worst impulses control us, about what we become when rage replaces reason, about the ultimate futility of violence without purpose. The most hated god, teaching us through his failures what the beloved gods taught through their triumphs. That civilization requires more than strength. That peace requires more than just winning wars. That being human means struggling against our own Ares-like tendencies every day, choosing wisdom over rage, strategy over chaos, building over destroying. And maybe, just maybe, learning to bind the war god in chains, not to honor him but to contain him, to acknowledge his existence while refusing to let him rule our choices, to understand that while war is sometimes necessary, it should never be desired. That violence, for all its immediate power, is always inferior to the patient work of wisdom, the most hated god. But through hating him, the Greeks taught themselves and us something valuable, about who we want to be, and who we must struggle not to become. If you enjoyed this journey through the myth of Ares, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments what god or goddess you'd like me to cover next. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more myths to explore. Until next time, may your battles be few, your victories wise, and your nights peaceful. Sleep well.